Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. Got lots of people coming in. I see Tom. Hey, Tom. Jennifer's with us. Welcome to Reimagining Traffic Enforcement in Oakland. We do have a few short updates from other cities as well, but for the most part, we're going to be talking about Oakland this evening. So thanks again for joining us. We'll give this another minute while folks join us. I think we've got about 30 or so people who have RSVP'd, which is great to see. And they're quickly coming in. I see Amanda's with us. Hello, Amanda. Bruce is with us as well. I believe you all can unmute yourself if you want. I ask that you keep yourself muted during the presentation. We're going to have about a 30-minute presentation on the recommendation that's before the Oakland City Council, or excuse me, that will be before the Oakland City Council soon. And then we're going to go into question and answers and then have a comment period as well. So stay on mute until we get to the comment period. And thanks again for joining us. Let me introduce myself for those of you who don't know. I'm Dave Campbell, the Advocacy Director with Bike East Bay. And I will be hosting this evening discussion with you. So again, you're on mute. We're going to do about a 30-minute presentation where I'm going to introduce the recommendation to you. And if you have a question about the recommendation, either you have a question now or one comes up during the presentation, please type your questions into the chat. Eileen is with me and she's going to capture the questions and create a list for us to go through after the presentation. So hopefully we'll get your questions answered. And then after that, with the remaining time, we're going to open it up for any comments or reactions you may have or concerns or ideas, or maybe something we haven't thought about for that kind of feedback. So save that till the end, but feel free to please give us your questions as we go along, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. And it looks like we got a good crowd with us at this point. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. One other point of housekeeping here. We are recording the presentation tonight, so we can put this on our website for other people to watch who weren't able to join us this evening. So I hope that's okay with everybody. In the chat is, and I'm going to add it again for those who've just joined us. This is a link to a Google spreadsheet that the city's task force has created. It lists all of the recommendations that are before the task force on reimagining public safety. The recommendation for moving traffic enforcement out of Oakland Police Department is recommendation number 59. So if while we're going through the presentation, you're interested in more details, you can get to the recommendation that way. And we'll put that back into the chat later on as well. So with that, let's jump in. I'm going to share my screen with you. And we're going to get started. Reimagining traffic safety, a recommendation to depolice traffic enforcement in Oakland. The link that I have here is the link to recommendation 59. That's the recommendation that we're going to be going over this evening. And before we get to the recommendation, the first part of this introduction is going to be a little background for you. I want to make sure you're aware of the information that the task force has been considering about stops in the city of Oakland. And what we're looking at here is data from the Oakland Police Department. It releases an annual stop data report every year. The most recent year we have is 2019. And you see in the upper left the breakdown of all police stops by race. And you can see the percentages there. In the lower right are the actual number of stops that the percentages are based on. So you can see the numbers and you can see the percentages. And you see them occurring over a period of 5-6 years here. And one thing you'll notice, well, the first thing you notice is based on race, African-American residents in Oakland are stopped way more than anyone else. And for your reference, for those who don't know, roughly about a quarter of Oakland residents are Black residents. It's a little bit less than 25% right now. Historically, it's been a little bit more than that. Hispanic residents are about a quarter of Oakland residents. White residents are about a quarter, a little bit less. Asian residents, a little bit less still than a quarter, and then the other category. So if you want to kind of get a sense of what would you expect if race was not a predictor of a stop, what percentage of each race demographic would you expect to see? And then you can compare these numbers to get a sense of the difference, the racial disparities here. And so you see that over the last 6 years, overall, the Oakland Police Department has made many fewer stops. They've actually significantly cut down on their stops, and that was very intentional by the Oakland Police Department. And let me back up just a sec. When we talk about stops, this is when Oakland police officer uses their discretion to stop you. Either you're walking or you're driving, or you're on a bike, perhaps as well. Those are what we call non-dispatch stops. The officer has initiated the stop themselves. They're not responding to a call from a neighbor or an Oakland resident that has gone through 911 or 311. It's officer discretion stops kind of out in the field. And so here, these are the numbers that show how much more likely you are to be stopped if you are a Black resident in Oakland. And you can see these are all the different legal reasons Oakland police officers have to stop people. And it gives you the percentages of those legal reasons why Oakland police officers stop people. And you'll see that traffic violations is by far the largest category. So if you are an Oakland resident, you're most likely to have an interaction with a police officer because you violated a traffic law, by far. And the numbers you're looking at here are 2019 data, which shows the traffic violations are about 64% of all stops. That number has held pretty steady, even as Oakland Police Department has cut down on the number of stops over the years. The percentage that are traffic stops is held pretty steady, kind of in that 65% range. And while I've skipped back to this slide, you'll see that in 2017, the total number of stops start to go down a little bit. And in 2018, that's the first year of what they call precision policing in Oakland, where the Oakland Police Department, by their own statement, have been more intentional about where they stop people and why they stop people. And as a result, you'll see the total number of stops have gone down. 2018, they go down a lot. 2019, they went down even more. And we'll look at a few more of the numbers around that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So there's your traffic violations, about 65% of all stops. All right, here we're looking at the all non-dispatch stops for traffic violations. This is the last 3 years. So now we're looking at just the traffic violation stops, not all stops, but just the traffic violations that make up about 65% of all stops. And you'll see here again, African-American Oakland residents, they're about twice as likely to be stopped based on the percentage of Oakland residents that are Black. Hispanic residents, they're stopped about just a little bit more than their percentage of residents. And then white, Asian, and other are stopped much less. And those numbers, as you see here, they've gotten a little bit better in the last 3 years, or 2019 is a little better than 2017, but they're still way off. Now we're going to break it down just a little bit more for you. There's two types of officers, more or less, who can stop you if you're out on the streets in Oakland. One is a patrol officer, and the other is a traffic officer, or a traffic division police officer. The patrol officers have general responsibilities for all crime in Oakland, whereas the traffic officers are primarily focused on traffic violations. That's their job. They're in the traffic division of OPD. They're a much smaller part of OPDs. That's why you see the patrol stops are much higher in numbers here. But what you can see here is the patrol division, the division that has more crime responsibilities, they're much more likely to stop you if you're Black in Oakland, much more than the traffic division. And it's not that the traffic division, they legally can stop you for other crimes. It's just not their assignment. It's not their priority. Whereas the patrol division is charged with addressing all potential crime activity. So the problem of racial profiling, the problem of racial bias in OPD is much worse in the patrol division. So we're just going to kind of summarize what we just looked at here. Over the last 6 years, Black people have represented about 25% of Oakland population, but 55% of all traffic violation stops. And of all the stop activity going on out there, what happens after the stop is even worse. As bad as it is that you're much more likely to be stopped if you're a Black resident, what happens after your stop is even more likely to be worse because you're a Black resident. You're twice as likely to be stopped as a white resident. You're 3 times as likely to be handcuffed. You're twice as likely to be searched after you're stopped. You're 3 times as likely to be handcuffed. And you're less likely to be cited or arrested than a white driver in Oakland. So think about that for a minute. Black drivers, they're stopped more often, they're searched more often, they're handcuffed more often, but they're a third less likely to have actually committed a crime. And that's getting at the racial profiling issue. And this is the data from Oakland's police department. The data is getting a little bit less worse, as we say. Precision policing started in 2017, about halfway through the year. But before that, only about 3% of stops had anything to do with crime priorities in Oakland. The police were just sort of randomly, whenever they and wherever they were, would stop somebody for a traffic violation. After that, precision policing, the police department got more intentional about where the hotspots are, where the crime priorities are, and they started focusing more of their stop activity in those areas. And so now, what was 3% of stops had anything to do with crime priorities, now it's about 33%. Still not as high as you'd like it. You'd kind of like that number to be 100% or something, I'm guessing, north of 90%. So it's still low. And in 2018, OPD stopped Black drivers for traffic violations twice as often as white drivers, yet cited and arrested Black drivers for traffic violations a third less than white drivers. That was in 2018. It got a little bit better, or a little bit less worse, if you will, in 2019. And then finally, the patrol division stops Black residents at much higher rates than the traffic division of OPD. How did we get here? Professor Sarah Seo wrote a really useful book that takes you back to the turn of 2 centuries ago, around about the 1900s. And in this book explains how police departments at the time went from, a very narrow set of criminal activity that they were watching for and protecting us from, to using the prevalence of the car that came about in the 19-teens, 1920s, 1930s, when all of a sudden everybody was breaking the law. Everybody driving their cars at some point would be breaking the law. And so police departments and police activity really expanded at that time. And interestingly, for those of us who live in the Oakland, Berkeley area, it was the Berkeley Police Department that led the way nationally. It was the Berkeley Police Department that first put traffic officers in traffic cars or traffic police cars. They were the first police department to give traffic officers walkie-talkies or radios. And they were the first police department to put their police officers in uniforms. They were the first department to put their police officers on bikes. Lots of innovation, if you will. So it's an interesting book that kind of takes you back through that early period of how traffic stops became such a huge part of police activity. And one thing that this country has to guard against this type of unconstitutional police activity is the Constitution. But the Supreme Court has said, if a police officer stops you for a traffic violation, if they're correct, you violated the traffic law, they are allowed to search and question you for any other reason, as long as that initial stop based on the traffic violation is legit. So the Supreme Court has really backed off of the Fourth Amendment protection against search and seizures in this area. All right, so now we've talked about the racial profiling problem with traffic stops. There's two other problems that we're trying to solve that I want to make sure you're aware of here. And the first one is that traffic enforcement really doesn't improve your safety out on the street. And most police officers who come to community meetings and talk to neighbors about safety issues, they'll say this themselves: as long as they're there, issuing speeding tickets, or as long as they're there, watching for traffic violations, safety may improve, but as soon as they leave, the problem will return. And we can't have a police officer on every block enforcing all of the violations. So what we're looking at here is, over the years, we've captured the data from the earlier chart here on the total number of stops, and you can see how it's gone down with the precision policing that the OPD started in 2018 in full. So there's been way fewer traffic stops. You might think, oh my gosh, I bet crashes and collisions have gone way up because the police aren't out there making us safe, but that's not true. You can see here collisions in Oakland have held steady. You can see that fatalities have held steady as well. So no correlation between the number of traffic stops and your safety out on the street. And then this is data from a report that the Oakdot and the Oakland Police Department just released last week. Excuse me. That the stops that they are making, the traffic stops that they are making, they're not on the high injury network, and they're not in the areas where the most serious collisions and crashes and where the most fatalities are happening. It's about 40 to 43% of the traffic stop activity is happening where the city knows the streets are most dangerous. And again, I'm guessing that percentage should probably be, I don't know exactly what it should be. It probably should be 80 or 90%, I would say. Something in the high percentages, not 40 or less than 50% for sure. And so the traffic division is not really responding to where known safety issues are. And so you might be wondering, where are they? It's more likely they're being deployed in high crime areas, not where the traffic safety issues exist. So traffic enforcement isn't necessarily effective for traffic safety. The third reason is cost. Police officers, they're thoroughly trained, they're thoroughly equipped for all sorts of serious criminal activity, and issuing speeding tickets is costing us more than we need that person to be trained to do. And the Oakland Police Department, they spend a lot of money on overtime, and a lot of their overtime is dealing with issues on the street. Often it's a demonstration, it's a protest. It could be an open street event as well. They permit a lot of the street closures that go on in Oakland. And they often spend upwards of about $30 million every year over their own budget. And so here you see the budget activity. Hang on one second. I want to change one thing about my screen while I'm got your attention here, right? So here's the Oakland budget. And you can see of the general fund, the money that the city council has to discretion on how to spend, 44% of it is spent on the police department. And this is broken down for you over here on the right. And you can see that the traffic operations division is $9.7 million. That's about 32 traffic officers in the OPD, a department that has more than 600 traffic officers. You'll also see on the right, special operations is around $12 million. And some of that is the traffic enforcement OPD does for street events, parades, demonstrations, open street events, stuff like that. So 32 officers in traffic operations. And so we're going to get to the recommendation to move traffic enforcement out of OPD. Some people have already reacted to that idea as being a very difficult proposal to agree with or understand. But I wanted to put up some of Oakland's budget information here. Oakland, as a city, is facing a huge budget deficit, and they just got the news from the federal government that they'll be getting $192 million in the next few years through the federal stimulus, but that's not going to cover their entire budget shortfall. And so before they knew they were getting that money, the city administration was already proposing to cut $15 million from the Oakland Police Department budget, more than the city council was even considering doing a year ago during the summer protest that happened last year. So the city administrator was already proposing to a hiring freeze in the police department, reducing the overtime, reducing Operation Ceasefire, reducing patrol activity, and the city administration has already directed OPD to stop all traffic enforcement. They did so as of January 23rd this year. And they're proposing to have no traffic enforcement in Oakland through June 30th. I don't know that they want that to be public information, but it is on their website, so it's publicly known. And so this idea of moving traffic enforcement out of OPD to Oakdot to have civilians do the traffic enforcement, as radical as that may be, it's certainly less radical than just stopping all traffic enforcement entirely, which the city administration has done and is proposing to do. So here is the task force that was formed last June. Oakland City Council directed the task force to come up with recommendations that cut the police budget by up to 50%. And so they formed the task force, and the task force has 5 advisory boards. You see them listed here. And I serve on the advisory board on the far left here, the Reducing Interactions with Police. And that advisory board has several working groups, each working on a specific issue. And the people I'm working with on my working group, we're working on this recommendation to move traffic enforcement to the Oakland Department of Transportation. And so this is a summary of that recommendation. It's recommendation number 59 that is in your chat, the link there. And let's just go through this. We're going to go through it in more detail. But the first and the main part here is a proposal to move traffic enforcement, all traffic enforcement responsibility, not just the people who are the officers who are in traffic enforcement, out of Oakland Police Department and into the Oakland Department of Transportation, and have civilian staff in Oakdot enforce traffic violations. And the goal of this is to prohibit pretextual traffic stops, a stop where an officer stops you for a traffic violation with the intent or with the goal of investigating a different crime that you're suspected to have involvement with. That's a pretextual traffic stop. And the police department needs the traffic violation in order to get that started. And this is the pretextual traffic stop. That's the problem that the US Supreme Court has said police departments are allowed to do. That is not illegal. Mind you, some state Supreme Courts have ruled it illegal under state constitutions, but it's okay under the federal Constitution. And so if we can separate traffic enforcement from the police department, you almost by definition eliminate pretextual traffic stops. The civilian traffic staff in Oakdot, they have no responsibility for investigating more serious crimes. And the remaining police department has no responsibilities for traffic violations. So there's no reason to escalate a traffic violation into an investigation of a different crime. In theory. In practice, it's probably a little more difficult than that. The third piece of this is to decriminalize minor vehicle code violations. That would be a change in state law, and replace them with infractions or reduce fines and fees, but also decriminalize a lot of the Oakland municipal code as well. And then fourth, if we're doing less enforcement or using civilians to do it, we want to strengthen Oakdot's ability to make our streets safe. And that involves giving them more responsibility, more resources to make traffic safety improvements, bring speeds down, and to equitably improve traffic compliance so there is fewer people speeding and there's fewer need to enforce anything at all. And one way this proposal seeks to do that is to empower community groups and neighborhoods to design their own streets with a toolkit and resources provided by Oakdot. And that's really something that neighborhoods and residents living on various blocks already do. They're continually communicating with Oakdot the problems of safety and speeding on their streets. We want to empower Oakdot to respond to that and allow that neighborhood to design the changes they want to see. And to the extent this is going to have an expense to it, which it will, some of the money can come from the police budget. We want to take as little from the police budget as we can to save that money for other programs to address the root causes of crime. And one option we have is to use city on-street parking revenues in Oakland, which bring in a lot of money every year to partially fund some of these changes. Now, I do want to make a note where this recommendation is only to move some of the on-street parking revenues to this program, not to touch the off-street parking revenues, a lot of which go to Measure Z. To do these changes, it is going to take a change in some laws. We're pretty sure we need a new state law that allows for unarmed civilian staff to enforce traffic violations. We hope that there'll be a bill introduced next year to make that change happen. So in the meantime, we have to do some of the things we can do here locally. Pretextual traffic stops, they're not per se illegal in California. They are in some states. And of course, some state courts, Supreme Courts have said they're illegal, but we would also like a state law that says they're illegal in California. That could be a separate bill. And also, pretextual traffic stops can be made a low priority or made counter to city policy and even county policy. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. Vehicle code, municipal code violations change to infraction. That's a combination of state law change and Oakland municipal code change. And then traffic calming and speed management. There's still some rules statewide that tie the hands of traffic engineers because of the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices that puts limits on what cities can do to slow cars down. And so we'd like to see some changes made there as well. In the meantime, there's some things that Oakland can do. So let's just go through these real quickly. Move parking enforcement into Oakdot. Oakland did that 3 years ago when they formed the Oakland Department of Transportation. So that's done. So that was their first attempt to, defund the police, if you will, and use money more efficiently. School crossing guards can move into Oakdot. City Council has authorized that. It hasn't happened yet, but it will be happening soon. Auto towing can move into Oakdot, or it can stay in Public Works, either one, but no longer would police officers be involved when a car is towed. Auto collision investigation can happen at Oakdot, or it can happen through a private company, as the city of New Orleans does. Event management of public streets, move that out of OPD and into the city administration office. That has actually already been approved by City Council. It hasn't happened yet. It's in the works. Oakdot is responsible for all Office of Traffic Safety grant applications. Currently, OPD does that. And Oakdot, of course, would be focusing those grants on high injury corridors, something that OPD does not do. Decriminalization, revise the Oakland Municipal Code. There's a lot in there that covers things that it really doesn't need to cover. Things like jaywalking, bicycling on oversized bicycle wheels, cruising. A lot of these things don't need to be crimes, infractions at the worst. And then traffic violation stop data is compiled and analyzed by Oakdot staff or the city administrator's office, not by OPD. And then this idea of investigatory traffic stops, where an officer stops a car with the intent of investigating another crime. Just stop all that, don't allow it. And then the heart of the recommendation, create a civilian traffic enforcement unit in Oakdot. So they handle all traffic violations in the city of Oakland. OPD would retain authority for a few things: outstanding warrants, felony vehicle stops, and then a narrow set of serious traffic offenses, such as excessive speeding, racing, suspected drunk driving, sideshows. We're proposing to keep that responsibility in OPD. And then, of course, Oakdot traffic staff can call for backup from OPD when needed. And then it's this combination that would preclude pretextual traffic stops and the racial profiling that comes with it in the city of Oakland. Oakdot is given responsibility for managing on-street parking revenues, as I said, and uses revenues from these parking facilities to pay for these added traffic enforcement responsibilities and some of the traffic calming activity and programs that they need to do. Make most traffic violations infractions, not criminal liabilities. And this is something that a lot of states have done. They've already done this. They've already made a lot of minor traffic violations an infraction, no longer a misdemeanor. Seattle did a really good job of detailing how fines and fees have a hugely, significantly greater impact on Black residents than the population in general up in Seattle, and the resulting financial difficulties through the criminal justice system. Canada already has instituted reforms that allow officers to impose some roadside administrative penalties, if you will, kind of a first step towards civilian traffic enforcement. And then the other piece of this is, and this is another recommendation coming out of the task force, is to legalize marijuana and other drugs. Where that has happened, you see a significant drop in traffic stops because so many traffic stops are related to drug activity. This is the pretextual traffic stop piece of it. A new state law or even a state Supreme Court decision. It's something that the OPD or the city of Oakland can do as a matter of policy. It's also something that the Alameda County District Attorney's Office can do. And I say that because the San Francisco County District Attorney already does it. They will not pursue any evidence that is obtained as a result of a pretextual traffic stop in the county of San Francisco. And Alameda County can do that as well. And And this is the empowering Oakdot part. So now the Oakdot department is in charge of keeping you safe out on the street. And so there's lots of ways they can do that. One is to bring down traffic speeds, because we know speeding is the most serious problem out on our streets that leads to crashes and injuries and fatalities. And we want to empower Oakdot to make these traffic calming improvements much more quickly. They're getting better at it. They're still unfortunately reacting to collisions and fatalities. They can be more proactive. They know where the high injury corridors are. They need to be able to go out there with the resources they need to talk to the people who live on those streets and let them design the safety improvements that are going to make them safe much sooner than more enforcement would do. And this would involve a toolkit that neighborhoods can use as Oakdot goes through this process. All right. To wrap this up, before we get to your questions and your comments, I want you to know what others are doing out there. How much of this recommendation is new and has never been tried? And not a lot of it, actually. In England, they have unarmed traffic officers that can do a lot of this stuff. They can't issue speeding tickets, but they can do pretty much everything else. New Zealand, this is probably the country that's done this the most. They, for 6 decades, had unarmed traffic enforcement personnel. They stopped it, I think it was around 20 years ago, for budget reasons. They found it wasn't saving them as much money as they needed at the time they were having a budget crisis. But it was working for 6 decades in New Zealand. Berkeley, Cambridge, and Washington, D.C., among others, they've already decided that they're going to study moving traffic enforcement out of their police departments. So them, like Oakland, are having these conversations. New Orleans, like I said, they have private collision investigators there that the parties hire. The city doesn't do it. In LA, they have an online reporting system for minor collisions that satisfy your requirement to report a crash and handles any insurance issues. Berkeley and also Fresno, they've already directed their police departments not to enforce minor non-safety related traffic violations because of the racial profiling problem. And then Florida has gone the most, at least in terms of introducing a new law. HB 1531 down in Florida, it hasn't been passed yet, but it's under consideration to require every city in Florida to establish an unarmed traffic safety division that does exactly what we're talking about here. And then, like I said, some state courts have already ruled that pretextual traffic stops are unconstitutional. So let's get to your questions and comments. Here are some of my questions as we go forward in these conversations. What do you think of unarmed civilian traffic services managers, for lack of a better name, pulling people over for speeding or any other serious traffic offense? How will DUIs be handled? Racing, sideshows, other types of traffic stops? How should those be handled? What does the public think of ending pretextual traffic stops? I ask that question because if you've been following the Berkeley Police Department on Twitter, kind of at the end of last year, they were tweeting out their pretextual traffic stops and saying how wonderful they were. They thought, look, we stopped this person for a traffic violation, and oh, look, we found a gun or we found drugs. Aren't pretextual traffic stops wonderful because they keep you safe? But what do you think of that? What do you think of ending that? What should be the relationship between traffic enforcement and crime enforcement? This gets at the heart of this new recommendation from Oakdot that is going before the City Council on March 23rd. It's an effort to redirect traffic enforcement to traffic safety and away from any crime enforcement activity. But some could argue that there should be an overlap or a connection between the two. What will the public think of speed-controlled arterial streets? If Oakdot goes out there and starts slowing traffic down on these busy arterials, we're going to expect some backlash to that as well. And then, is there a way to pilot some of these recommendations rather than do this all at once everywhere throughout the city? Can some of these things be tried in certain parts of Oakland and not others? And are there certain parts of the recommendation that can be tried before other parts of the recommendation can be tried? So just some of my questions for you, and I want to get to your questions as well. So let me pull those up. Let me stop sharing first. All right, so let's take the first question I've got here from Leah. Is there an overlap from the 2019 data regarding traffic stops and the percentage of Black drivers stopped? An overlap from the 2019 data regarding traffic stops and the percentage of Black drivers stopped. Leah, are you still with us?
I am.
Feel free to unmute. Leah, can you restate your question? I don't think I fully understand it.
In a later slide, it was strictly just showing, I think, 2017 through 2019 data. And I wanted to know if the data presented on 2019 traffic stops was then the same that was on a previous slide around specifically Black drivers that were stopped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the 2019 data for Black drivers stopped it's not as bad as it was in 2018 or 2017. In other words, the racial disparities have gotten a little bit better starting in 2018 and then better still in 2019. So there is overlap, yes. But if you looked at the 3 years together, like the data that we saw, it looks a little bit worse because you don't see the fact that it's getting better in the year 2013. Pardon me while my cat is making noise behind me. I'm gonna take care of that. Okay, sorry for that interruption. So Leah, let me know if that did or didn't answer your question. You can put something into the chat while I go on to the next question from Bruce. Can we automate traffic violations using cameras? This would dramatically reduce interactions. Yes, the cameras can be mobile, so people do not get used to these specific locations. So Bruce, yeah, there's a couple types of cameras out there under consideration. There's red light running cameras, and there is a proposal in Oakland to look at reinstituting red light cameras in Oakland. Other cities have used them and do use them. And then there's speed enforcement cameras, which are currently not legal in California, but there is a state bill to introduce automated speed enforcement cameras in the state of California. There was a press conference earlier this morning by Assemblymember Chu, who introduced the bill. And so that will go before the state legislature to see if the law can be changed about speed enforcement cameras. And Bruce, you make a good point there. Where you put the cameras can have a racial disparity in its impact. And of course, where you put them, drivers could get used to them and thus know where they can get away with speeding and where they can't. And so moving them around may be a solution to that issue. So those are the two types of automated cameras that are under consideration. And I'll say this about I'll say it about both cameras is if those are implemented in any city, the fines and fees that go with them need to be reformed as well. And so that's definitely part of Chu's bill, and that's definitely part of the conversation. But it's not an easy conversation because it's not easy to use red light cameras or speed cameras and not have a disproportionate impact on low-income drivers. And so that's an important issue that needs to be considered. All right, let me just go back to Leah's comment. Yes, those speed cameras are used in DC and have been used since 2012. Good to know. Thanks, Leah. We're gonna go on to Jennifer's question. Can traffic safety training be offered as required curriculum in elementary school so that the population grows up knowing why certain behaviors are unsafe for everyone on the road? I hope so, Jennifer. Yes, traffic safety curriculum in our schools, I think is a really good idea. And so this gets back to what is traffic compliance and the need for enforcement. If everyone obeyed the rules of the road because they were trained and taught to do that at a young age and continued to do that, we would need much less enforcement. We would have much higher traffic compliance. And that's the goal, is high traffic compliance and little need for any enforcement at all. So I think, Jennifer, you're hitting on a good point. Traffic safety education in the schools is the way to get that started. I agree. Question from Tom. What do we know about the impact of on-street parking enforcement on racial and ethnic groups? Wow, good question, Tom. I don't even think I've asked that question. We have asked, we've gotten some feedback from people concerned about unarmed civilian enforcement of traffic violations. They've asked, well, what has it been like for unarmed parking enforcement officers out on the streets of Oakland? And the data that we've gotten back is it's very rare that the parking enforcement officer is, people yell at parking enforcement officers a fair amount, but it's very rare that they're attacked or assaulted or injured on the job. It does happen. I think it's something like maybe once or twice a year in the city of Oakland, and there's 40 parking enforcement officers. So we've gotten that feedback on the staff, but the racial disparities of the on-street parking enforcement, I'm going to ask that question. I didn't even think to ask that question, so I appreciate that here. And let me see, Jennifer, you've got some other questions here I wanted to get to. One of the questions was, what traffic violations are bicyclists most frequently pulled over and cited for? Let me tell you that for all traffic violations, speeding is the #1 citation that Oakland residents get by far. The traffic violations that cause the most serious harm are speeding, failure to yield, running red lights, and then failure to yield when you're turning, making a turning movement, are some of the traffic violations that cause the serious injuries and fatalities, and are where the high injury corridors are identified. So we have that information for all traffic violations and collisions. For bicyclists, I'm sure Robert Prince, our education director, he probably has that information, and I could go look it up, but I don't recall what it is. I do know that the Oakland Police Department have pretty much stopped pulling people over on bikes. For now, it's been for a couple of years a very low priority for the Oakland Police Department. And so the numbers are so low. If you look at all the traffic stop data and the percentage that are bikes, it's really small. Jennifer asked a question, what is the cause of any disparity in who gets stopped? And that's kind of the heart of this discussion. What causes these racial disparities in stops? And the traffic safety report that Oakdot just put out last week, it has an interesting statistic in it. It looks at the racial breakdowns of people involved in collisions in Oakland. And African-American residents are involved in 33% of collisions. And so they're about 25% of the population. The traffic division stops Black residents at about 39% of all traffic stops. And Black residents are 33% of collisions. And so what's causing the disparities? We definitely know some things that are causing the disparities. It's one, police officers investigating more serious crimes. That's what we're trying to get at. But even the traffic division that's not investigating more serious crimes, they still are stopping Black residents more than their population, and even more than the likelihood that a Black driver is involved in a collision. So we don't know the answers to all these questions. The police department doesn't have the answers for us. And it's the source of a lot of frustration and anger by Black and Hispanic residents in the city of Oakland. It's 6:20 now. I want to give y'all some time for comments. If you want to provide your comments, your reactions, please raise your hand. I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself and share your thoughts with us. Just raise your hand and I'm happy to call on you with the few minutes that we have remaining. Anybody got a comment or a reaction? If not, I might call on you if I can. At the end of my presentation, I was asking some questions. Let's just start with the first one. What do you think of an unarmed civilian traffic monitor pulling you over if you're driving or riding your bike? Leah, I heard from you earlier. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
I mean, I would support that versus someone who is armed. So I think Portland, I'm actually transitioning to the Bay Area, but my place of work is based in Portland. And I'm a transportation planner and involved with bicycle advocacy there. And I know that Portland Police Department is talking about, or advocates to propose what you just said, having a group of civilians, unarmed civilians responsible for those type of infractions is being considered too. So of course, as a Black bicyclist, no gun is better than a gun, so.
Okay, anybody have serious concerns about that you want to share? We've heard from others. Well, if you do,
a concern
go ahead, Jennifer.
Regarding the legality of carrying guns, and that if it's supported that everyone should be carrying a gun in a community, is that somehow undermine the whole concept of de-escalation, and should be working with advocates for controlling guns in general to make it a safer place for everyone to be, not just the traffic controllers.
Yeah, so that's when we've heard from people concerned about having unarmed civilian traffic monitors pulling over cars. Almost the first thing you hear is, everyone in Oakland has a gun. So why would we want an unarmed person pulling over somebody who's got a gun in a car? And I think you're right, Jennifer, getting at gun control and getting a better handle on gun ownership in this country is a huge problem and a huge priority.
Well, having said that, I think, once people get used to the idea that there's no gun, that they're probably less likely to, attack, if you know what I'm saying. So, but of course they may not know that for a while. But I also had a comment, in Castro Valley, we were able to report like a few, there's warning sort of education letters that the CHP will send out for certain violations. And one of them is the 3-foot passing violation. And I wonder, if you had these sort of automated cameras, especially if they were roaming and all that kind of thing, just you talk about decriminalizing. What about just sending out these letters, like, so people know, like, hey, we did see that, so you're not just getting away with it, and maybe even maybe the punishments, they have to get some education, or you just tell them, in the letter why this is a problem, educate them in the letter, basically, like this is can cause collisions and things like that. Yeah, so Bruce, you're suggesting looking at like private videos, is that right? No, well, you could do, so in our case, it's private videos that we're able to, well, you don't need a video at all. I do use a camera and I document everything, but all you have to do is call the CHP and they just take your word for it that you got, buzzed or whatever, and they send out a letter. So we can do that with official cameras that are placed around in the street without any harm. It's just letting the violator know that they were, that we caught you violating, and please don't do it. Yeah.
Gotcha, Bruce. Okay, yeah, thanks. Another interesting idea, kind of in that automated realm of enforcement to consider. I do want to go over a couple other questions that have come up in the chat. Interesting insights here. Do you have a breakdown of the traffic data, non-dispatch and patrol with the race comparison by council district? We don't have that by council district. We've seen it by hotspots, like looking at a map of Oakland where they show hotspots. And generally the crime hotspots in Oakland are in 3 areas. One is the downtown area, the Fruitvale, heart of the Fruitvale area, and then deep East Oakland as a hotspot. Those are the 3 main hotspots in the city. And if you look at the high injury corridors and where the serious crashes are happening, they generally happen in those areas, but the alignment is not anywhere close to where it should be. And that's why you see only 40% of the traffic stops are made on the high injury corridors. Another good question here. What support, if any, do you need from individuals and organizations to make the recommendations a reality? Good question. If you want to tune in, tomorrow night, the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force will be meeting at 6 p.m. If you go to the city website, you can Google their Reimagining Public Safety page and get information on tomorrow's meeting and listen in to the conversation about the task force and how they're going to come up with these, how they're going to decide on these recommendations. They're going to be sending these recommendations to Oakland City Council in April, and the council will start taking up these recommendations going forward. And probably through the end of the year, they're going to be weighing in on various aspects of these recommendations. And so that's going to be your time to weigh in on this at the city council. And a lot of these recommendations are very progressive, and they'll be facing a lot of pushback. Even this recommendation has been facing some pushback. And so the city council is going to need to know they have your support to move forward on this. And that's just in Oakland. I can also let you know Berkeley is doing this. They're forming a task force to come up with recommendations. This Thursday, the city of Richmond is going to have a community listening session on reimagining public safety. And the conversation around traffic enforcement will be part of that as well. And then Hayward has also been having some conversations around reimagining public safety. So I think in the East Bay, at least, it's mainly Richmond, Oakland, Berkeley, and Hayward that are having these conversations. San Francisco's also been having similar conversations as well. If you know of some other cities that are having these conversations, please drop it in the chat for us. Eileen, I know you're with me, my coworker. Is there any other questions that you see in the chat that I've missed before we wrap up?
We had a couple come in, but we can also follow up with folks afterwards if there are additional questions that that we weren't able to get to. So I have a list of the questions, and for folks whose questions we didn't get to, I'll be sure to connect you and Dave after the fact so that you can communicate more over email if you like.
That sounds good. So thank you, Eileen, for doing that. I mentioned the Richmond, you got the link there. Thanks for putting that in. And like I said, tomorrow is the Oakland Task Force meeting. And this afternoon, I mentioned that Assemblymember Chu introduced the automated speed enforcement bill in the state of California. So these are some of the things that are going on currently around these conversations. The Oakland Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Commission will be meeting Thursday at 6 p.m. And they're also going to be taking a look at this recommendation to move traffic enforcement out of OPD into Oakdot. So if you regularly attend the Oakland BPAC meetings, you'll see that this Thursday. And like I said, these conversations will be continuing here and statewide and nationally, probably for a long time. And it's super exciting work. Bike East Bay is honored to contribute to this work as best we can, lending our experience working with the Oakland Department of Transportation and working on traffic safety issues. That's what we do. That's the heart of what we do, making streets safe. Lending it to this conversation about how to reimagine public safety and make sure your public tax dollars are spent for the best bang for their buck. So thank you for joining us at 6:30. This is just the start of the conversation. Bikey Spay is going to be talking about this more going forward as well. So we'll look forward to inviting you back to join us again and learn more about how we can make these happen. Getting back to that good question we had earlier, how can you help us make this happen? Stay tuned. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you. Thanks for your questions and your comments and for your interest in this issue. Have a good night.